heard a lot about the evolution of the cookie, the limitations, regulations, certifications yesterday, and day 2 is under the stars of the future. So how are we evolving in the future? What is the cookieless future? Which new innovations could help us change the ad tech industry, the marketing industry, our tracking? What is the AI hype? How does this play into role also in terms of regulations? Which new technologies are out there on the market? And as promised yesterday, we will settle a long time feud between the Austrian cookies. More to that in our very first coffee break, but it will be awesome. I can tell you that. Before we start, I want to again very much welcome everyone in the name of JENTIS who is organizing this event today, and also thank our sponsors for making this possible. We have Virtual Minds, OneTrust, Captcha, the Dialogue Marketing Association Austria, Marketing Exchange Platform Nespresso, Almdudler, and the Internet Advertising Bureau Austria. Like I just said, today will be all about the future. We will start again with part 2 of Montulli, who will go into the development of the cookie, third-party cookies and tracking. We also will hear about the ad tech industry from Tom Peruzzi, data clean rooms from Martin Possekel. We will have a panel about the cookieless future and remarketing. We will hear about the new New Data Protection Act in Switzerland, and new technologies changing the future of tracking from JENTIS. In the afternoon, there will also be a talk about the EU-US data transfers and the case against Google Analytics from the Austrian Data Protection Authority. We will hear about the data ownership outside of the web, just like yesterday, but today it will be about the automotive industry. And last but not least, about the AI revolution and the impact on ad tech, and the concept of privacy by design from Anke Wukien. And also, in the evening, there will be the announcement of the winner of the Cookie of the Year. So everyone, be ready, because we need your votes today. Just like yesterday, I want to remind everyone of the rules that we have in here. First of all, it's all about networking. I think last night already proved that we are definitely good at that. I saw a lot of nice conversations, a lot of people mingling. What might work better today is, when you hear my voice, that you come back in, because we are on a strict timeline, especially today, because we will need to end very sharp in the end of the evening. So let's please try and come in whenever we start. And with that, I'm already handing over to Montulli for his part 2. Montulli is one of the founding engineers of Netscape. He is very well known for inventing the cookie and a lot of other technologies. He's one of the 6 inductees in the World Wide Web Hall of Fame, and he yesterday already outlined how he started the cookie and how it evolved into what looked like tracking, and how it then actually became a tracking tool, third-party tracking, and how he and his team decided to keep it even though they had multiple opportunities to stop it. So he will open up to us and be very honest how this whole thing actually then happened, and then dive into a search for innovation, the AI hype, and how all of this is also in need for technological evolution, regulation, and implication on the whole industry. Montulli, everyone.
Welcome back to day 2 of Heroes of Data and Privacy. I'm Montulli, and we're going to continue talking about cookies and privacy. Yeah, so shortly after discovering that cookies were being used in an ad network, we felt that something ought to be done about it. But I also need to kind of give you the context of the world as it was happening. So back in 1996, probably late 1996, when we were going through this, we were also essentially struggling to survive as a company, because Microsoft was working very diligently to put us out of business. We were also competing against proprietary networks like MSN and AOL. And the web was still on an uncertain footing. Like today we look around and say, well, the web's here to stay, the internet is definitely the dominant network. But back then it was still there was still some doubt as to who would win the battle for the hearts and minds of the consumer. What network would evolve to become the king of all networks? And it's also important to note that because of network effects, if one network wins, it probably gains a foothold for a very long period of time, because content producers want to be where the content consumers are, and whoever gains the most traction will probably win for a very long period of time. So it was under that umbrella in which we were making a decision, and also need to understand that advertising was the backbone of revenue for most of the internet at the time. There were some online shopping sites, but this is also before it was clear that online shopping like Amazon and other things were going to be a dominant or even an interesting play. It's still very early. So almost all websites really lived and died based on ad revenue. And therefore without ad revenue, there would be unlikely to have much content on the web. It was with all that, we were faced to make a decision. So we could do one of three things as we saw it. So we could just disable third-party cookies entirely, which would essentially remove the ability for ad tracking to work at all back in those days. So there are different technologies now that could be substituted, but back in those days, cookies were the really only viable method that one could do any form of real ad tracking. Two, we could do nothing. We could just leave the status quo there. Didn't feel that was right because, again, these tracking networks were violating the spirit of cookies. Or two, we could try to find a middle ground. And the middle ground that we actually ended up choosing was to bring cookies more into the user's viewpoint, and also to give the end user control over cookies. So both through the user having control to turn off third-party cookies entirely if that's what their choice was, to have finer grained controls, i.e. Allow third-party cookies to be used on some websites and not others. Options that would allow them to clear their cookies at the end of every web session, those sorts of things. So that's what we implemented. And essentially what we were saying is we want to support advertising on the web because it's the only revenue model, and the web is an important resource that needs to survive. But we also want to make sure that users have the choice of having high-end privacy, i.e. just turn it off, or they could still participate in the status quo. And in this case, defaults are very, very important, right? So we chose the default to be that third-party cookies remained on, and the user would have knowledge that cookies were being used. So we added icons and various other things, but not to turn them off by default, because turning them off by default would essentially mean that most users would probably never touch that, and then ad tracking would essentially be disabled across the web. Most people now ask me whether that was a good decision or not. so that's a really hard one to answer. I think at the time it was the correct decision, and I will kind of backtrack my way into it. One can debate the merit of whether the internet is a positive force for good or not, but I would say that the decision to allow ad tracking to continue did provide a great deal of revenue to the web and helped get it to the point where now it is the dominant network. And we're not faced with having our networks controlled by a single corporation or any single government or anything like that. The web is truly now owned by humanity and will continue forth and probably remain the dominant network for some period of time, hopefully for a long period of time. The other side of this is it's better the devil you know than the devil you don't. At this point, the ad industry is hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars. With money, there will always be a way to subvert the best attempts of technologists to preserve privacy. And an argument I've made for the last several years is that cookies as the central point of control for ad tracking is a reasonable compromise, because users have a viable option to turn them off. And all the other options for tracking that we know of today, things like fingerprinting and various other JavaScript methods, are completely out of the control of the user. So if the ad industry moves to other tracking technologies, or whatever they're calling them, the user will no longer have the option to opt out, if you will. So cookies, because they are both visible and under the user's control, and they're also a technology that can only be utilized by very public-facing networks, i.e. you need to have a large number of websites participating in the network. You can't just secretly go out there and track people. It's a mechanism that we all understand we have the ability to opt out from, and if we're going to allow ad tracking, it's a very reasonable method because of those safeguards. Well, cookies, as much as they've become in the news for ad tracking technologies, are still really the only and still the best method for giving the web some form of memory. We actually spent quite a few years in the IETF community, that's a Internet Standards organization, thinking about ways in which we could either improve upon or replace cookies, and there were really no better alternatives. We did come up with a proposal for some slight tweaks to the cookie, but the basic principles are still pretty much exactly the same. That IETF proposal for cookie enhancements was never taken up by any major web browsers and basically stalled out. So cookies in their original embodiment are still a very useful mechanism on the web, and they're a core part of what makes the interactive web possible. I'm totally fine with my technology no longer being implicated with the with the ad world. I think that would be fine with me. But I also think there are positives and negatives here. So the positive is that we could be moving to a world where there is more privacy affirming ad technology. So there have been multiple proposals there to try to keep all the data locally and simply express your ad preferences as an aggregate preference to the ad network. That's a form of personalization that does not reveal your browsing habits. There is the other side of it is that if we don't get to a method in which independent ad networks can be financially viable, and we do turn off the third-party cookie, we're essentially creating a possible world where independent websites that rely on ad networks no longer have a viable funding alternative. It takes a fair amount of size and revenue in order to support your own advertising network or set of servers. And right now, smaller websites rely on plugging into a larger ad network. And so if cookies are just turned off and we don't have another viable mechanism to support those ad networks, then small independent websites that rely on advertising may lose a good deal of their funding. And only the larger sites, especially the first-party sites like Facebook, Google, Apple, the larger websites, they will have a viable funding model, and all the advertising will shift to them. So the big players will gain and the small players will lose out. So I think it's very important to understand that there's an ecosystem here. They've relied on a certain technology. And if you just pull that technology out and don't replace it with something else, then it could be that a lot of our smaller voices and a lot of these independent publishing sites may lose access to their major revenue stream. It's very difficult to permanently solve privacy issues with pure technological means. Whenever you have a large financial base that is incented to interrupt your privacy, if you try to solve it on a pure technical means, you're essentially kicking off an arms race of two different technological sides. One side trying to protect privacy, and the other side essentially coming up with technological means to violate it. Yeah, I'm definitely more in favor of late regulation. I think when an industry is growing, unless that industry is clearly at odds with sociological norms or the whatever danger we may foresee in them, it's much better to let the technology grow, adapt, and reach some reasonable equilibrium before we try to add legislation around it. The reasons are many, but the first one being is if you bring in regulation too quickly, you're likely to just kill all the innovation that is likely to happen in the early part of an innovation cycle. And the second one is you're very likely to just very incorrectly target the wrong sets of technologies and or solutions, because the innovation cycle is so rapid right now that they're so rapid at the beginning of a new technology that the problems of today are very unlikely to be the same problems a year from now or even 2 years from now. And of course, legislative cycles are much longer. It usually takes at least a year just to figure out what to put on paper into a bill, and trying to pin down where the technology is at any one time is very difficult when it's moving really rapidly. So I like that there was very little regulation around the internet in the early days, and then at a certain point we've developed equilibrium around many things, and now is the time for certain technologies to if necessary, obviously it's restrictions around change are not necessarily a good thing unless there's a real sociological reason to adapt them. So I'm definitely more of a late stage legislative guy, and to be very careful and precise with that tool, because it can be heavy-handed. Yeah, AI is a really tough one. I definitely see both sides to the debate, right? There is definitely cause to be concerned about advanced general intelligences, and certainly the danger that they would have to society if they actually came to be. But we're also in a state where we appear to be not really on the right track for general intelligence. Certainly some people would disagree with that, but I think it's easy to look at a large language model like GPT and infer human level thinking inside it, when what really it's doing is it's just a really advanced parrot. There is no real model in its head about how the real world works, and it doesn't really think in the way that we think. So I think it would be premature to look at GPT and say we've invented a real general intelligence in any way. It is, interesting in that it's getting the world to think about AI in an interesting way, and we should be concerned particularly with the alignment problem of AGI. But it's also one that we're not making a great deal of progress on or understanding, because frankly we don't know how general intelligences will form, nor do we know how to build them, nor do we know how they will actually perceive the world. I've said this before, but I still think this is my happiest memory, is that we were able to build all this technology and release it back to the world. So it's not owned by a single corporation. It's not controlled by anybody. Our core principles of let's build this thing and essentially give all the keys to the kingdom away to humanity, I think was a wonderful core principle, and I still support it. I still contribute to open source software. Open source software and the movement for open standards is a great one, and I think if I could be remembered for anything, I would like it to be that I helped move that movement forward and helped promote the idea of being able to make a good living doing what we're doing while still creating technology that gives back to the world. Ah, yes. My favorite real life cookie is oatmeal chocolate chip.